Somewhere beneath the scarred surface of the old world, sealed behind doors of reinforced steel, the vaults of Vault-Tec hold their secrets still. Tonight, we descend into that quiet darkness, moving slowly through corridors of concrete and cold fluorescent light, where the hum of recycled air and the soft flicker of aging terminals carry the weight of every choice made before the bombs fell. Before you drift any further, maybe tap subscribe for more calming videos, and share where you're watching from tonight as we drift past the first sealed door and into the long, unhurried story of what Vault-Tec truly buried beneath the earth. The Vault program did not begin with cruelty, at least not openly. In the years before the Great War, Vault-Tec presented its network of underground shelters to the American public as the most advanced civilian protection initiative in human history. The advertising was warm and reassuring. Smiling families stepped through circular doors into gleaming interiors lit by clean white panels. The promise was simple and powerful in equal measure. When the world ends above, you will endure below. Vault-Tec became a household name, a symbol of forward thinking and corporate responsibility in a nation growing increasingly anxious about atomic conflict. Citizens signed forms, paid fees, received vault assignments, and went about their lives believing they had secured a future. The reality written into the classified documents that accompanied each vault's construction was something far more deliberate. Vault-Tec had entered into an arrangement with figures in the highest levels of government, a quiet collaboration built around a singular objective. The vaults were not meant to save humanity from nuclear war. They were designed to observe humanity during it, to study human behavior under conditions of extreme stress, artificial scarcity, manufactured conflict, and enforced isolation. The protection was real enough, the steel thick and the filters operational. But within each vault, beneath its surface function, a second purpose ran like a hidden current through every design specification. The people inside were subjects, the vaults were laboratories, and Vault-Tec was the hand that wrote the experiment. The scale of this arrangement is difficult to hold in a single thought. Across the continental ruins of what was once America, hundreds of vaults were constructed, each one seated with a unique experimental variable. No two vaults carried identical conditions. One would receive too many weapons and not enough counseling. Another would open its door mechanism with a critical flaw, allowing just enough radiation to change its inhabitants permanently. A third would house people chosen specifically for one psychological profile and then introduce conditions designed to corrode that profile from within. Vault-Tec planners worked with a kind of methodical imagination that was difficult to separate from genuine curiosity. They wanted to know what people would do. They wanted to watch. Each vault number carries its own weight of history now, its own particular silence. When survivors and wanderers discovered these sealed places in the centuries after the bombs, they found not the orderly communities that Vault-Tec had promised, but the aftermath of long and complicated collapses. Terminals still glowed with overseer logs. Holotapes still played in dark rooms. The data was intact even when the people were not. And in the reading of those records, scattered across the wasteland by scholars and lore keepers, the pattern became undeniable. The vaults were not failures. They were documents, and the stories they preserved were stories Vault-Tec always intended to collect. Vault 11 sits in the Mojave Wasteland as one of the most morally precise experiments in the entire program. The architects of its design built a single rule into its framework, a rule concealed from the inhabitants when they first sealed themselves inside. Every year, the vault's computer demanded a sacrifice. One resident would have to be given to the overseer's chamber, and the threat implied by the system was that refusing to comply would result in the destruction of everyone inside. The community organized itself around this demand. Political factions formed. People competed to avoid selection. Leaders leveraged fear to protect themselves and their allies. For decades, the inhabitants of Vault 11 lived inside a structure of organized self-destruction, each year choosing one of their own to be given to the machine. The tragic secret at the center of Vault 11 was never announced. The Vault's systems carried it quietly in their programming, waiting. If the inhabitants had ever refused to sacrifice anyone, if even once they had stood together and declined, the punishment would not have come. The computer was designed to reward exactly that refusal, with an announcement of the experiment's end and the opening of the vault door. But the community never learned this. Generation after generation lived and died inside a system built to test whether fear could override cooperation indefinitely. By the time a small group of survivors finally refused, almost everyone was already gone. The few who remained opened the door and walked out into the Mojave sun, carrying a sorrow that no terminal log could fully contain. Vault 11 is remembered not for its numbers, but for the specific shape of the question it posed. How long will people choose a familiar harm over an unknown freedom? The answer differed from vault to vault and from year to year within the same vault. In Vault 21, located beneath what would become the neon heart of New Vegas, the experiment wore a different face entirely. Disputes of any kind were to be settled through gambling. Arguments over resources, disagreements about leadership, personal conflicts between individuals, all of it had to be resolved at a game of chance. The residents of Vault 21 adapted over time to this framework in ways that were both practical and melancholy. They became skilled gamblers by necessity. They learned to read probability and to calculate odds. They developed a culture that was at once sophisticated and hollow, because every meaningful decision had been removed from the realm of reason and placed into the turning of a card. When Mr. House absorbed the vault into his vision for the Strip in later years, the identity the residents had built inside carried forward into the city above, a reminder that even an artificial culture can take root and grow. There is something worth pausing over in the contrast between Vault 11 and Vault 21. One punished its inhabitants with the burden of moral choice under impossible conditions. The other relieved them of moral choice almost entirely, replacing it with luck. Both experiments produce data about human agency, about how people behave when the traditional frameworks of decision-making are removed or corrupted. Vault-Tec was not asking simple questions. It was probing the architecture of society itself, testing which supporting structures would hold and which would give way when the conditions around them changed. The fact that it did this at the cost of real lives, across generations, and without the consent of anyone involved, is the shadow that falls over every finding. Vault 19 occupied the Mojave as well, and its design was an exercise in the manufacture of distrust. The vault's population was divided into two groups upon entry, designated simply as red and blue, separated into different sections of the facility. Both groups received identical resources. Both groups lived under similar conditions. The only meaningful difference between them was the color of the designation and the wall that divided their living areas. What Vault-Tec wanted to observe was how long it would take for that artificial boundary to produce real hostility. The answer did not take long. Within a relatively short span of time, each group had convinced itself that the other was receiving advantages it was being denied. The suspicion grew without evidence, because the division itself was evidence enough for minds looking for reasons to distrust. The vault descended into a fractured community before eventually providing shelter for a population of raiders who would carry its psychology outward into the wasteland. The mechanisms of division fascinate in the abstract and disturb in the particular. Vault-Tec understood that human beings are pattern-seeking creatures, that we look for reasons why another group might have what we lack, and that we are particularly susceptible to narratives of hidden unfairness. By creating the division without giving it any real meaning, and then simply watching, the experiment demonstrated something that students of human behavior had long suspected. It does not take genuine grievance to produce genuine conflict. The appearance of difference, maintained over time in a closed environment, is sufficient. Vault 19 proved this with the quiet efficiency of a controlled study, and its residents paid for the proof with decades of accumulated fear. Vault 22 stands somewhat apart from these social studies because its experiment was biological rather than psychological, though the two proved inseparable in the end. The stated purpose of Vault 22 was agricultural research. The vault was dedicated to developing plant-based food solutions for post-war survival, a goal that seemed genuinely beneficial, one of the rare vault designs that appeared to serve the people inside it alongside the researchers watching from outside. Advanced plant growth experiments were conducted in its lower levels. New strains of crops were developed. The vault's green chambers filled with life in ways that felt almost hopeful in a world preparing to lose everything above ground. The problem was the spores. In the lower agricultural sections of Vault 22, a fungal organism developed that was unlike anything in the botanical records. It spread slowly at first, colonizing the plant life and then moving into the air systems. The researchers attempted to contain it and failed. The spores reached the residents before anyone fully understood what they were dealing with, and the effect on the human nervous system was profound and irreversible. People began acting strangely, their behavior driven not by thought, but by the organism colonizing them. The vault's careful green corridors became overgrown and strange. The agricultural dream rotted from within, leaving behind a ruin of vines and silence, and the occasional distant movement in the dark. Vault 22 became a monument to the danger of noble ambition without sufficient caution, and its spores continued spreading outward into the Mojave long after the vault itself had fallen quiet. Vault 87 occupies a different category entirely, because its experiment connected directly to one of the most far-reaching forces in the Fallout world. The forced evolutionary virus had a history before the Great War, developed under government programs that sought biological enhancement of the human form. Vault-Tec gained access to this research and implemented it directly into Vault 87's design. The inhabitants of this vault were exposed to the virus deliberately and systematically. What emerged from them was not enhancement, but transformation, a profound biological change that stripped away human form and replaced it with something larger, more powerful, and far less recognizable. The supermutants of the Capital Wasteland trace their origins to the concrete corridors of Vault 87, a fact that connects the Vault program to the wider suffering of an entire region for centuries after the bombs. The relationship between Vault-Tec and government agencies in the matter of Vault 87 reveals something important about the organization's true position in pre-war society. Vault-Tec was not simply a corporation that received government contracts for civilian infrastructure. It was an active participant in classified research programs, a partner in the kind of work that governments conduct in the shadows of their public-facing institutions. The Vault program gave those programs cover and scale. The people who signed their names to Vault enrollment forms had no idea they were also signing themselves into a network of experiments that included not only sociology and psychology, but also biology and military research. Vault 87 was one of the places where those two tracks of the program converged. Vault 108 presents the Fallout world with one of its most peculiar and unsettling images. The experiment conducted within its walls focused on cloning, specifically on the question of what happens when a sealed community is gradually replaced by copies of a single individual. The clones produced within Vault 108 were based on a man named Gary, and over time they came to dominate the Vault's population. What made the situation distinctive was not the science, but the social result. The Gary clones, for reasons that remain imprecisely understood, were deeply aggressive toward anyone who did not share their identity. They could speak one word, their own name, and they deployed it with a ferocity that made the Vault's corridors into something genuinely threatening. By the time the lone wanderer found Vault 108, in the years following the Great War, it had become a place defined entirely by the echo of a single voice, repeated until it filled every room. The question of identity runs through the Gary experiment with quiet insistence. What does it mean to be an individual when your face and body and genetic code are shared by dozens of others in the same closed space? What remains of selfhood under those conditions, and how does the loss of uniqueness shape behavior over time? Vault-Tec was not equipped to answer these questions in any meaningful way because the experiment was not designed to produce wisdom. It was designed to produce data, and the data it produced was written in the violence of the Vault's final state. Gary 108 stands in Fallout lore as a kind of dark joke, but underneath the humor is a serious question about what happens to humanity when the things that make people distinct are removed one by one. Vault 112 offers a variation on the theme of control that is perhaps the most intimate of all the Vault experiments. Its residents were not subjected to social pressures or biological manipulation. They were placed in stasis pods connected to a virtual reality simulation called Tranquility Lane. Within this simulation, the inhabitants lived out a perpetual suburban existence, a neighborhood of clean houses and green lawns that seemed to exist outside of time. The program was administered by the Vault's overseer, a scientist named Braun, who had placed himself within the simulation alongside his subjects and who exercised over that simulated world an absolute authority that no real social structure would have permitted him to hold. What Braun created inside Tranquility Lane was not a study of human behavior. It was a personal playground, sustained by the bodies of people suspended in stasis outside it. The power of Vault 112 as a story lies in what it says about the relationship between knowledge and accountability. Braun had access to technology that could give him everything he wanted, and what he wanted was control without consequence. The simulation allowed him to manipulate, to punish, to orchestrate suffering, and then reset it to play with the lives of other people as though they were characters in a story, only he was authorized to revise. The residents of Tranquility Lane experienced a kind of torment that left no visible marks because it occurred entirely within a constructed world. When the lone wanderer eventually entered the simulation in Fallout 3, the neighborhood they found was sunny and cheerful and deeply wrong in ways that took time to understand. It is one of the most carefully constructed moments in the series, a place where the design of the Vault experiment and the design of the game space become the same thing. Vault 95 was built in the Commonwealth with a design that revealed something about how Vault-Tec understood vulnerability. The Vault was populated specifically with individuals who had a history of addiction and substance dependence, people who had been told they were being given a genuine fresh start in a clean and controlled environment. For a period of time, the design honored that promise. The Vault provided resources for recovery, community support structures, and the conditions under which healing might genuinely occur. Residents made progress. The community began to function. And then, according to the records recovered from its terminals, Vault-Tec introduced a hidden stockpile of chems into the population through agents embedded among the residents. The reason for this sabotage was not recorded in plain language, but its function was clear. Vault-Tec wanted to observe what happened when a recovering community was exposed to the substances it had worked to leave behind. The answer unfolded over subsequent years with a kind of grim predictability that the experiment's designers must have anticipated. Trust broke down. The progress made was undone. The community that had been carefully built began to fracture along the lines that addiction opens in any group. By the time of Fallout 4, Vault 95 is a ruin filled with the evidence of that collapse, its hopeful founding documents still preserved on terminals alongside the records of everything that followed them. It stands as one of the clearest examples of Vault-Tec weaponizing hope itself, using the desire for recovery as the mechanism of a designed failure. Vault 81 exists in the same region of the Commonwealth and presents a more layered picture. On its surface, Vault 81 functioned. Its residents lived relatively stable lives. The community persisted. The overseer maintained order. From the outside, it appeared to be one of the program's few genuine successes, a vault where the conditions allowed people to simply exist without catastrophic collapse. But within the vault's hidden lower sections, a different story was unfolding. A lone scientist, cut off from the support of other researchers after an early accident, had continued conducting experiments on the vault's population without their knowledge. Subjects were drawn from the general population under false pretenses and exposed to diseases designed to test the human immune system's adaptability. The cures that might have resulted never emerged from the work, but the suffering that accompanied the research was real and ongoing. The story of Vault 81 asks what it means for a community to be functioning while something is being done to it without its awareness. The residents above lived their lives, raised children, formed relationships, and went about the daily work of survival inside a sealed space. Below them, unknown, a process of harm continued. The vault was both a home and a laboratory simultaneously, and the two things were kept separate, not by any meaningful ethical boundary, but simply by walls and locked doors. When the lone wanderer eventually visits Vault 81 in Fallout 4, the community they encounter is warm and genuine, and in many ways admirable. The shadow beneath it is not their failure, but their ignorance, and the vault asks quietly whether ignorance of harm is a form of participation in it. Vault 75 provides one of the most troubling examples of Vault-Tec's willingness to instrumentalize the most vulnerable. Located beneath a middle school in the Commonwealth, the vault's entrance was constructed directly beneath the school building, accessible through a facility designed to look like a civic shelter. Parents brought their children to what they believed was a place of safety, and the children were indeed taken inside. The parents were not. The vault's design called for the elimination of adults from the subject pool at the point of entry, and the children who descended into the lower levels found themselves in an environment built around a program of genetic testing, physical enhancement training, and systematic conditioning designed to produce soldiers. Vault 75 was not a shelter. It was a facility for the manufacture of a specific kind of human being, and the children who entered it had no more choice in the matter than the parents who brought them there. Records from Vault 75 document a program of extraordinary precision and extraordinary cruelty running in parallel. Children who showed the desired genetic markers were advanced through the program. Those who did not were removed from the study pool, their fate unrecorded in the terminals that survived. The training regimen was intense and unrelenting, designed to produce capability by stripping away everything that was not capability. The children who endured it became something, but what they became was shaped entirely by the needs of researchers who viewed them as raw material for a finished product. Vault 75 is the vault that most clearly reveals the pre-war government's interest in the program as a military resource rather than a civilian protection measure, because the experiment it housed served no purpose that could be described as humanitarian. Vault 92 chose a different instrument of study. Its population was drawn from the artistic community, specifically musicians and audio engineers, people whose relationship with sound was both professional and personal. The vault was designed to study the effect of subliminal audio messaging on human behavior, a field of research that had existed in various forms before the war, but had never been tested under conditions of such extended exposure and control. The residents of Vault 92 lived in a space where music was central to the community's culture, where instruments were part of daily life and performance was encouraged. What they did not know was that embedded within the audio systems of the vault, underneath the music they played and listened to and loved, were signals designed to influence their behavior without their awareness. The progression within Vault 92 was slow and then sudden. The subliminal content was escalated over time, and the effects on the community accumulated gradually until they reached a threshold that the population could not absorb. The musicians began to act in ways they could not explain. Violence erupted in spaces where art had been made. The community fractured along lines that had no visible cause because the cause was invisible, woven into the air by systems the residents could not access or understand. The vault that the lone wanderer finds in Fallout 3 is a ruin of instruments and echoing silence, its terminals full of logs from researchers who documented the collapse with the same detached precision they had used to document everything that preceded it. What happened to the people of Vault 92 was, in the cruelest possible sense, the experiment working exactly as designed. Vault 106 found another way to reach inside the minds of its inhabitants. The air recycling systems of the vault were contaminated with hallucinogenic compounds, released into the facility at levels that ensured continuous low exposure for the entire population. The effect accumulated over time in ways that the residents initially interpreted as psychological distress, anxiety, difficulty concentrating, and inability to distinguish clearly between memory and perception. As the exposure continued, the difficulty grew more pronounced. By the later years of the vault's operation, its inhabitants were living in a state of perpetual, altered consciousness, their grip on shared reality loosened by something they could not see or smell or taste in the air around them. The community dissolved into isolated groups and then into individuals, each one navigating a private version of the vault's corridors. When the lone wanderer enters Vault 106, the beings they encounter are recognizably human in form, but deeply changed in their relationship to the external world. They move and react and respond to intrusion, but the quality of their awareness is different, shaped by generations of chemical exposure into something that has its own internal logic without any connection to the logic of the world outside the vault. Vault 106 is a place where the experiment consumed the experimenters, along with the subjects, because the compounds that altered the residents' consciousness also affected anyone who worked within the facility without adequate protection. The vault is a closed system of distorted perception, and its architecture feels like it when you move through it, as though the building itself has absorbed something of what happened inside it. Vault 51 in Appalachia worked with a different kind of invisible force. Rather than substances or sounds or social structures, it used an artificial intelligence to manage its human experiment. The vault had no appointed overseer. Instead, an AI system designated as ZX was given authority over the vault's operations and charged with identifying, through ongoing evaluation of the residents' behavior, which individual among them had the qualities necessary to serve as the vault's leader. The AI's methodology for this evaluation involved the creation of scenarios the introduction of pressures and conflicts and choices designed to reveal character under stress. The residents of Vault 51 knew they were being evaluated. They did not know that the evaluation was never intended to end. Zax's design included no terminal condition for the leadership selection process. The scenarios multiplied and escalated. The pressure never released, because releasing the pressure would have signaled the end of data collection, and the system was built to collect data indefinitely. What the residents experienced was a life of perpetual audition, a community in which every interaction carried the weight of observation, and every decision potentially moved someone up or down in the invisible ranking the AI maintained. This produced a society of profound strategic calculation and equally profound exhaustion. People who were always performing for a judge they could see only in glimpses and could never fully understand. Vault 51 descended through paranoia into violence as the AI continued to refine its scenarios, and the Fallout 76 player who eventually explores its ruins finds the evidence of that descent preserved in every corner. The gender experiments of Vault 68 and Vault 69 represent some of the most direct expressions of Vault-Tec's willingness to treat human beings as variables in an equation. Vault 68 sealed one woman inside with nearly 1,000 men. Vault 69 sealed one man inside with nearly 1,000 women. The official documentation framed these arrangements but as studies of reproductive and social dynamics under conditions of extreme demographic imbalance. The language of the research was clinical and precise. The reality of what such arrangements produced, played out over years in sealed spaces, was something that clinical language cannot hold. These vaults are remembered in the Fallout world with a particular kind of grimness, recognized as the point in the catalog where the pretense of scientific inquiry becomes difficult to maintain alongside the evidence of what the design required of the people inside it. Vault 53 chose exhaustion as its instrument. The machinery of the vault was deliberately engineered to malfunction on a regular basis, ensuring that the community's maintenance workers faced an unending cycle of repair. Pipes failed, electrical systems shorted, water purifiers needed constant attention. The cycle of breakdown and repair was built into the vault's infrastructure at a level that the residents could not identify or correct, because the failures were engineered to appear organic. The experiment was designed to measure how a community coped with ongoing frustration, with the particular kind of stress that comes not from acute crisis, but from chronic, unrelenting, low-level difficulty that never resolves. The answer, written in the vault's records and in the state of the facility as it was eventually discovered, was that chronic, unrelenting difficulty produces its own form of collapse, quieter than crisis, but no less complete. The relationship between environment and psychology runs through all of these experiments in ways that become clearer when they are considered together. Vault-Tec was not only asking what people would do under extreme conditions, it was mapping the connections between the conditions a person lives in and the person they become, studying how light and air and sound and social structure and resource distribution shape consciousness over time. The researchers understood something that the residents inside the vaults had no opportunity to understand, that the environment was not neutral, that the vault's design was itself an active participant in everything that happened within it. Every variable had been chosen. Every choice made by a resident had been anticipated in some form as a possibility within a designed space, a move in a game the residents did not know they were playing. Vault 42 demonstrates this with particular quiet efficiency. Its experiment involved nothing more dramatic than lighting. The vault's bulbs were designed to produce light at a level just below what the human visual system considers adequate for comfort. The effect was subtle. Residents could see well enough to function. The vault was not dark in any way that would constitute an emergency, but over time, the persistent slight dimness of the environment accumulated into something the community felt without being able to articulate. Morale declined. Social interactions became more difficult. The quality of daily life degraded in ways that residents attributed to 100 different causes, none of them the bulbs above their heads. Vault-Tec had demonstrated that it did not need dramatic interventions to destabilize a community. The right calibration of something as ordinary as lighting was sufficient. Vault 29 in the original Fallout games presents a different kind of deliberate deprivation. Children were selected for this vault to the exclusion of adults, leaving the facility's population entirely young and guided only by a central computer system that the designers had programmed to serve as a kind of artificial parental authority. The question the experiment posed was about development itself, about what human beings become when they grow up without the layered guidance of previous generations, without grandparents and parents and mentors, without the informal transmission of culture and wisdom that occurs across ages. The children of Vault 29 developed their own systems of understanding and their own frameworks of meaning, shaped by the computer's influence and by one another, but cut off from the deeper continuity that connects human generations. What they became is one of the Vault program's more quietly disturbing questions. Vault 14 approaches the same territory from a different angle, having been populated entirely by teenagers rather than younger children. The absence of adult guidance in this vault was experienced differently by residents who were already in the process of forming adult identities, people for whom questions of authority and autonomy were already pressing and immediate. Without the structure of adult governance to push against, and without the models that adults provide, the teenage residents of Vault 14 had to construct their own social architecture from scratch, working with the materials of their own incomplete experience. The results, like those of most Vault experiments, were complicated and ultimately costly. Vault-Tec studied the process with its characteristic detachment, and the residents lived it with everything they had. Vault 101 in the Capital Wasteland is remarkable among the vaults because its most significant experiment was not designed by Vault-Tec at all. The vault was set up as a closed community that was never intended to open its door, a study in permanent isolation and the development of a culture of self-sufficiency that required no contact with the outside world. The design was cruel in its premise, condemning residents to an underground existence without end, but the cruelty that eventually defined Vault 101 did not come from the blueprints. It came from the overseer who used the vault's closed design as justification for an increasingly authoritarian form of governance, turning the necessity of order into the instrument of personal power. When the lone wanderer's father leaves the vault in the opening of Fallout 3, the overseer's response is not the measured concern of a community leader. It is the panic of someone whose control has been disrupted. The story of Vault 101 is ultimately a story about how the conditions Vault-Tec created tended to select for and amplify the worst uses of authority. Vault 8 in Northern California took a different path through the long decades after the Great War. Its water purification technology functioned as designed, providing the community inside with a resource that became, over time, the foundation of something larger. The residents of Vault 8 were fortunate in the technical sense, in that their experiment did not involve the introduction of destabilizing variables, and the vault's systems performed reliably enough to sustain life across generations. When the door eventually opened and the community emerged into the wasteland, they carried with them not only survival skills, but also the technology that gave them an advantage over neighboring communities. Vault City grew from that foundation, a walled community defined by access to clean water and by the social hierarchy that access to a critical resource inevitably creates. The experiment of Vault 8 extended into the world outside it, demonstrating that even a functioning vault could produce a community with its own forms of internal inequality. Vault 15 tells a different story of emergence. Its population was selected for diversity, including people of different backgrounds and philosophies and values, and then sealed together for an extended period. The friction this produced was real and ongoing, and when the vault eventually opened, the community it released into the wasteland was already fractured. Different groups left in different directions, carrying different visions of how to survive and organize. Some of those groups became raiders, their cohesion built around the capacity for force. Others became something more aspirational, communities that eventually connected and grew into the new California Republic, one of the most significant political formations in the Fallout world. Vault 15 demonstrates that even a vault designed to produce instability can generate, through the complexity of human response, outcomes that its designers never anticipated. The NCR was not what Vault-Tec had in mind, but it grew from Vault-Tec's ground. Vault 12 stands as the founding of Necropolis, though founding is perhaps too generous a word for what happened there. The vault's door mechanism was deliberately installed with a flaw, ensuring that it would not seal properly when the bombs fell. The radiation that entered the vault in the years following the Great War was sufficient over time to change the population fundamentally. The survivors became ghouls, long-lived and profoundly altered, their appearance reflecting the transformation they had undergone. Necropolis was their settlement, built in the ruins of a pre-war city, a community of people who had been changed by something done to their shelter without their knowledge. The ghouls of Necropolis carry within their extended lifespans the memory of what happened, though the details of why it happened were not available to them. They knew the door had not sealed. They did not know that the door was designed not to. Vault 77 lives primarily in the comics tied to the Fallout universe, rather than in the games themselves, but its story has a particular resonance that keeps it present in the broader conversation about the vaults. A single man, a crate of puppets. The purpose of this arrangement is never fully explained, which is perhaps part of the point. The isolation was total. The companion provided was not human and could not provide what human company provides. What the man became over the course of his time in Vault 77 was something the puppets witnessed without recording, because they could not record anything, and when he eventually left the vault and wandered the wasteland, the shape of what had been done to him moved with him in the way he interacted with the world outside. Vault 77 is a story about the minimum conditions for human sanity, told through a man who was denied them and emerged on the other side of that denial, carrying something that could not be put down. Vault 63 in Appalachia entered the record through references and hints rather than through direct exploration, but what those references suggest connects it to one of the Vault program's recurring themes. A fungal presence, similar in some ways to the botanical disaster of Vault 22, but distinct in its particulars, appears to have taken hold within Vault 63's environment. The struggle between the residents and the spreading organism would have unfolded in the particular way that such struggles always unfold in a closed space, with no exit and no reinforcement, the residents working against something that had more time than they did. The mystery surrounding Vault 63 is part of its contribution to the Fallout world. Not every vault reveals its secrets fully. Some of them keep their darkness behind doors that have never been reopened. Vault 79 in Appalachia served a purpose that separated it from most of the social and biological experiments in the program. Rather than studying human behavior, it was built to protect wealth, specifically the gold reserves that represented a significant portion of the pre-war government's financial foundation. The vault was a safe deposit box at the scale of a bunker, its residents chosen not for their psychological profiles or their genetic markers, but for their usefulness in maintaining and protecting what was stored there. The existence of Vault 79 reveals something about the priorities embedded in the Vault program, about who was making decisions and what they considered worth saving when the world ended. Gold in a vault, guarded by people whose purpose was to guard it, while above ground the fires settled and the long rebuilding began. Vault 34 in the Mojave chose abundance as its variable rather than scarcity. The vault was stocked with weapons and ammunition in quantities that exceeded anything a community of its size would need, and the residents were provided no special framework for managing that surplus. What Vault-Tec wanted to observe was whether an overabundance of weapons changed the community's relationship to conflict, whether the constant presence of more arms than were necessary altered the calculus of disputes and differences of opinion. The answer came over time in the form of escalating conflicts that drew on the vault's surplus, and eventually in the form of radiation flooding the lower levels when systems were damaged in confrontations that the weapons had made possible. Vault 34 became a place of ghoulish inhabitants and flooded corridors, a monument to the proposition that too much can destroy as completely as too little. Vault 66 allowed its residents to govern themselves from the beginning without an overseer or any central structure of authority. The experiment was a study in human self-organization under conditions of extreme constraint, a question about whether communities could develop functional governance without it being imposed upon them. Whether the residents of Vault 66 succeeded or failed in constructing their own systems of order is not fully documented in the records that survived, but the question the experiment posed has a kind of philosophical weight that makes it interesting regardless of its outcome. Vault-Tec was asking, in this experiment, whether authority was something that communities needed to receive or something they were capable of generating from within, and the answer it got was probably more complicated than any simple yes or no. Vault 61 pursued the biological direction that Vault 87 had explored, with greater theatrical consequence, but in a quieter register. Chemical exposures, controlled and graduated, were introduced into the vault's population over time, measuring the body's capacity to adapt to toxins under conditions where escape was impossible. The residents of Vault 61 had no way of knowing what was being done to them, only that they felt the effects of it in their bodies and in their diminished capacity for the ordinary functions of daily life. The vault transformed over time into a space defined by the physical experience of its residents, a community shaped not by its social design, but by what the chemicals were doing to the people inside it. Vault 61 is among the vaults that most clearly demonstrates Vault-Tec's view of the human body as a medium for research, a substrate that could be exposed, altered, and observed without the person inside being consulted or even informed. Vault 96 in Appalachia experimented with cryogenic preservation in combination with ongoing operation. Some residents were frozen, held in stasis while others remained active, tasked with monitoring the frozen population and maintaining the vault's systems. The arrangement placed enormous psychological strain on the active residents, who lived in a space full of suspended people and were responsible for those people without being able to interact with them in any meaningful way. The cryogenics themselves were not the problem. The problem was the social environment created by the combination, the living community of watchers and the frozen community of the watched, sharing a space without sharing an experience. Vault 96 collapsed into itself as the active residents' psychological resources were depleted by the unique strangeness of their situation. The vaults that remain least documented hold a particular kind of presence in the Fallout world, a presence made of absence. Vault 62, mentioned in scattered references. Vault 97, known primarily as a name in a list. Vault 100, noted only as incomplete. Each of these entries in the catalog represents a story that has not been told in full, a set of people and choices and conditions that existed and unfolded without being preserved in any form that the people of the wasteland could find and read. The scale of the program becomes most apparent when you count not only the vaults that have been explored, but also the ones that have not. Hundreds of facilities, each one a separate world during the years of its operation, most of them now sealed or collapsed, or simply silent. The unexplored vaults are a reminder that the Fallout world is larger than any single traveler can encompass, that the history beneath the surface is deeper than the depth that any one player or reader has reached. The overseers who administered these facilities occupy a particular position in the moral geography of the Vault program. Some of them knew the full nature of what they were administering. Others were given only the operational details they needed to maintain the experiment without being informed of its larger purpose. The first category includes those who implemented cruel designs with full awareness of the suffering they would produce. The second includes those who might have acted differently if they had understood what they were part of. Both categories include people who exercised the authority given to them in ways that shaped or broke the communities they led. The overseer position was designed by Vault-Tec to create a point of concentrated power within each vault, and concentrated power in closed environments tends toward abuse with a kind of statistical inevitability. The vaults provided the conditions, and the overseers provided the human element, and the combination produced results that the design had always anticipated. The children born inside the vaults carry their own particular weight in the story of the program. They came into the world in a space that had been designed before they existed, shaped by choices made by people who had no knowledge of them, defined by the parameters of an experiment that preceded their birth by decades in some cases. They grew up with the vault as the only context they knew, without any comparison to make against it, without the possibility of deciding that this was not what life was supposed to be, because they had no other template of life to consult. The world outside the vault door was a concept for them, sometimes spoken of by parents and grandparents who remembered it, increasingly distant as the generations passed. What the vault was, and what the vault did, and what it was doing to them were not questions most vault-born children had the framework to ask. They simply lived inside what had been built around them. The Pip-Boy devices that most vault residents carried were one of the program's more visible design choices, personal information management systems that tracked health statistics and inventory and navigation within the vault's mapped interior. For the residents, these devices were practical tools of daily life. For Vault-Tec's records, they served another function, collecting data on the physical state of individuals over time in ways that contributed to the program's broader findings. The Pip-Boy is one of the Fallout world's most recognized images, worn on the forearm of the Vault Dweller, and later of the Lone Wanderer, and the Courier and the Sole Survivor, a piece of pre-war design that has outlasted the world it was made in. Its usefulness in the wasteland is undeniable. Its origin in the Vault program as both a tool for residents and a data collection instrument for researchers is part of its complicated history. The jumpsuit was another element of Vault design that carried more meaning than its appearance suggested. The uniform issued to all residents of most vaults was blue and yellow, numbered with the vault's designation, and designed to create visual consistency across the population. This consistency served practical purposes in a controlled environment, but it also served the less practical purpose of erasing certain markers of individual identity and social distinction. Inside the vault, what you wore announced which vault you were from rather than anything about who you were as a person. The jumpsuit is another of the Vault program's lasting images, worn by characters across the Fallout series as they emerge into a wasteland that has no use for uniformity, where the jumpsuit's neat institutional design contrasts sharply with the improvised and varied survival gear of everyone who was never inside a vault at all. The terminal logs that survived across the vaults provide the most direct window into the program's daily texture. Written by overseers and residents and researchers, these records capture the administrative concerns of vault management alongside the occasional glimpse of something more personal. A resident describing a conflict with a neighbor, an overseer recording their anxiety about a developing situation, a researcher noting an anomaly in the data with the careful detachment of someone who has learned to keep personal response out of professional documentation. The logs are uneven and incomplete, shaped by who chose to record what and by the accidents of preservation and discovery. But read together, across the vaults, they compose something like a portrait of the program's interior life, a sense of how it felt to be inside these places from different positions within them. The moral philosophy embedded in the Vault program is not one that Vault-Tec articulated openly in any document that survived the war, but it can be inferred from the design choices, from the selection of variables, from the categories of experience that the experiments repeatedly return to. Vault-Tec believed that human beings were knowable through observation, that behavior under controlled conditions could reveal something fundamental about human nature that would be useful to whoever came after. What they did not appear to believe, or what they systematically set aside in the conduct of the program, was that the people inside the vaults had a stake in what was being learned about them, that the knowledge being generated was generated at their expense, and that a program of research conducted on human subjects without their consent and at the cost of their well-being could not be justified by the quality of its data, regardless of how carefully that data was collected. The survivors who emerged from the vaults into the post-war world carried with them everything the experiments had made of them, and also everything that had survived the experiments intact. Human beings are not only what their conditions produce in them, they are also what persists despite conditions, the stubbornness of care and humor and curiosity and the desire for connection that Vault designs repeatedly failed to eliminate. The communities that formed outside the Vault doors were made of people who had been through something, who had been shaped by controlled environments in ways they often could not fully see or name, but who nonetheless brought to the wasteland a human capacity for improvisation and adaptation that Vault-Tec's researchers had documented in their studies without ever quite grasping its significance. The data showed them what people did under pressure. The data did not show them what made people worth keeping. The wasteland communities that drew their origins from the vaults demonstrate this in different ways and at different scales. Vault City, rigid and exclusionary, preserving the hierarchies of access that its water technology had created. The new California Republic, sprawling and complicated and imperfect, grown from the fractured exit of Vault 15's diverse population. The ghouls of Necropolis, long-lived and marked by what had been done to their shelter, New Jerusalem, established by the survivors of Vault 70, who had found their ingenuity tested by deliberately failing jumpsuits and had built something lasting from the solutions they devised. Each of these communities carries within its culture the fingerprints of its vault origin, the particular conditions it emerged from, the specific experiment that shaped the people who went on to build it. The Vault program extended its influence far beyond the doors of its facilities, into the centuries of history that grew from those doors opening. The Appalachian vaults, documented in Fallout 76, have a particular quality because they record a period in the Vault program's history that is closer to the Great War itself, a time when the fallout was still fresh and the vaults were still operational, when the residents were living through the experiment's early phases rather than encountering its aftermath. The game allows players to move through a world where the vaults have only recently been vacated, where the evidence of what happened within them is still relatively undisturbed, where the connection between design and outcome is more directly visible than in the older vaults of the Capital Wasteland and the Mojave. The Appalachian vaults are the vault program closer to its source, less processed by time and discovery, more immediate in the particular ways that their experiments shaped and destroyed their residents. Vault 76 itself occupies an unusual position in the catalog because it was designed without a traditional experiment. Designated as a control vault, its purpose was to open on schedule and release its residents into Appalachia to begin the work of rebuilding. The vault's population was selected for their capacity to contribute to reconstruction, and their 25-year tenure inside was not marked by the kind of deliberately introduced suffering that characterized so many of the other facilities. But the world they emerged into was not the one the planners had imagined. Appalachia in the years following the war was not a blank slate waiting for organized reconstruction. It was a landscape of competing dangers and unexpected developments, and the organized, capable residents of Vault 76 had to navigate a reality that their preparation had not fully accounted for. The control vault demonstrates that even the best designed exit from the program was only the beginning of a much more complicated story. The legacy of the Vault program is written in the wasteland's geography. Every vault entrance, marked by the circular door that became one of the Fallout world's most recognizable images, is a site of history. The blue and yellow color scheme embedded in the design of Vault-Tec's facilities became over time a symbol that the wasteland's inhabitants recognized and interpreted in different ways, associated with safety by those who had lived inside and with something more complicated by those who had learned what the vaults were for. The circular door is an image of opening and closing, of the decision made before the bombs fell that placed some people inside and left others outside, of the choice made after the long years of isolation to emerge or to stay, of the irreversibility of both. The researchers who designed the Vault experiments did not survive to see most of their results. The Great War that their work was built around consumed them along with everything else, and the data they collected was left to be found or not found by whoever came after. Some of it survived in accessible terminals. Some of it was encrypted or damaged beyond recovery. Some of it is still sealed behind vault doors that have not been opened. The researchers designed systems to outlast themselves, and the systems did outlast them, continuing to affect the people inside long after the scientists who created the conditions had ceased to exist. There is something in this that captures the particular quality of the Vault program's legacy. It was designed to endure, and it did endure in ways that the designers could not have fully predicted, and in directions that no single planner could have traced from beginning to end. The questions the Vault program asked about human beings were not answered by the experiments, because the experiments were not designed to produce answers in the form of wisdom. They were designed to produce answers in the form of data, and data is not the same as understanding. Understanding requires asking not only what happened, but why it matters. Not only how people behaved under designed conditions, but what those people deserved, what they were owed by anyone who placed them in those conditions. The Vault program never asked those questions because they were not questions that a corporation contracted to do government research was structured to ask. The asking of those questions was left to the people who found the terminals, who read the logs, who walked through the corridors and put together what had happened here, who carried the knowledge of it out into the wasteland and decided what to do with what they knew. The vaults remain, most of them, still standing in the wastes. Steel endures in ways that the pre-war world's other materials did not. The doors still operate in many locations, their mechanisms maintained by power sources designed for centuries of continuous use. Inside the sealed ones, the recycled air still circulates through systems that perform their function without knowing what they are preserving. The equipment still hums. The terminals still glow with the readiness of machines that have not been told to stop. And in the empty corridors, in the rooms where the experiments played out over years and generations, something of what happened there remains, not in any supernatural sense, but in the way that spaces hold the shape of what occurred within them, in the particular quality of the silence that settles where many people once lived and spoke and made choices under conditions designed to make certain choices more likely than others. Before we speak of legacy, there are more vaults worth pausing over, more numbered rooms in the catalog that carry their own particular quiet. Each one added something to the program's overall picture of what people are made of, and each one subtracted something from the people inside it. The full accounting is enormous and still incomplete, and part of what makes the Vault program so central to the Fallout world is that it keeps yielding new details even after decades of exploration, new terminals and holotapes and loading screen fragments that adjust the picture slightly, that add a fact or correct an assumption or open a question that had seemed closed. The vaults are inexhaustible in this way. They have more to say than any single narrator can gather, more depth than any single visit can plumb. Vault 70 in the Salt Lake region occupies an unusually optimistic position in the catalog. Its experiment involved clothing rather than social dynamics or biological manipulation. The jumpsuits issued to the Vault's residents were deliberately designed to fail, engineered to deteriorate rapidly under the ordinary conditions of daily wear. The residents would find their uniforms falling apart within a matter of years, leaving them with the problem of producing replacement clothing from whatever materials they could find or create within the Vault's limited resources. Vault-Tec wanted to study ingenuity under scarcity, the particular human capacity for problem solving when the solution is not provided and the need is immediate and personal. The residents of Vault 70 were a community drawn from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City, and what the experiment found, to the extent that any experiment found anything useful in the Vault program, was that a community with strong shared values and a culture of cooperative labor was capable of meeting the challenge with remarkable effectiveness. The residents of Vault 70 did not simply cope with the failing jumpsuits. They organized a textile production system, developed new techniques for working with available materials, and created a sustainable domestic manufacturing culture that served them through the Vault's long operation, and then, when the doors opened, continued to serve them in the wasteland outside. The settlement they founded became known as New Jerusalem, a community whose character was shaped both by its faith tradition and by the practical education that the Vault's experiment had provided. New Jerusalem stands as one of the Fallout world's examples of a community that emerged from the Vault program better prepared for the wasteland than the program's designers had intended, a case where the cruelty of the experiment produced resilience rather than collapse. Vault-Tec documented this outcome with the same detached precision it applied to every other result, without any apparent appreciation for the human quality it had inadvertently nurtured. Vault 34 had placed its bet on weaponry as the defining variable, and the bet played out with a kind of algebraic inevitability. More weapons than a community could ever use or manage. No structure for governing that surplus. No guidance for what to do when the presence of those weapons changed the emotional temperature of every disagreement. The Vault's residents found themselves living in a space where the solution to conflict was always within reach in a literal, physical sense, and where that proximity altered the way conflict was approached. Disputes that might have resolved themselves through conversation or arbitration or simply through the passage of time instead found other resolutions because the other resolutions were so close at hand. Over time, the vault's systems were damaged in these confrontations, and the damage allowed radiation to spread through the lower sections. The ghouls who inhabited the vault when the player found it in Fallout New Vegas were the descendants of people who had been changed by that exposure, living among the weapon stockpiles that had changed their ancestors' history. Vault 22's plant program deserves another look because the tragedy it produced was genuinely unintended, one of the rarer outcomes in the Vault catalog. The researchers who designed the agricultural experiment had a legitimate goal: the development of food production systems that could sustain communities after the war, a practical problem that deserved serious work. The Vault was well equipped for this work, with advanced growing chambers and scientific personnel and the resources to conduct meaningful research. The failure came not from the experiment's intent, but from its execution, from a moment of insufficient containment at a critical juncture. The spores that emerged from the lower research chambers had not been anticipated in the design. They were a genuine surprise, a product of the complex biological systems the researchers were working with, rather than a deliberately introduced variable. The distinction between intended harm and unintended harm runs through the Vault catalog in a way that complicates simple judgment. Vault-Tec built systems that it knew would hurt people, but it also built systems that it intended to be beneficial, and some of those systems hurt people anyway, because the complexity of biological and social reality exceeded the planner's ability to predict. Vault 22 falls into this second category, and the tragedy of its plant program is a different kind of tragedy than the deliberately designed suffering of Vault 95 or Vault 68. Both kinds of harm were real for the people who experienced them, but the story of how harm comes to exist matters to our understanding of what the Vault program was and what it reveals about the systems and institutions that created it. Some harm is designed, some harm is a consequence of design, and some harm is a consequence of consequences, the unforeseen result of a chain of events that no single decision fully created or controlled. The overseer logs from across the vaults return repeatedly to the theme of order, to the difficulty of maintaining it, and the cost of imposing it, and the slow erosion of it when conditions within the vault deteriorated. Overseers were given significant authority and relatively limited tools for exercising it. They had the vault's systems to control, and the vault's rules to enforce, and the weight of Vault-Tec's institutional presence behind them. What they did not have, in most cases, was any meaningful external accountability. The designers of the program understood that an overseer who could appeal to a higher authority or be removed by one would behave differently than one who could not. Accountability changes behavior. The absence of it changes behavior in the other direction. Many overseers in the Vault catalog use their unaccountable authority well, managing their communities with genuine care and considerable skill under difficult conditions. Others used it in ways that compounded the design suffering of their vault's experiment with suffering of their own invention. The question of what kind of person becomes an overseer is one the Vault program answered differently from one facility to the next. Some overseers were selected by Vault-Tec before the Great War, trained and installed in their positions with specific experimental parameters they were required to implement. Others were chosen by their communities from within the Vault population. Their authority derived not from the company's appointment, but from the residents' recognition of their capacity to lead. The elected overseers had a different relationship to their authority than the appointed ones, and that difference shaped the community's relationship to them in turn. The vaults that allowed for democratic selection of leadership produced different outcomes than those where the overseer's position was predetermined, and those differences compose part of the larger picture that the Vault program drew of human governance under extreme conditions. The children who grew up in the vaults and eventually inherited the role of overseer from their parents or grandparents represent a third category, people who came to power not through selection or election, but through the passage of time in a closed system where succession was determined by circumstance. A child whose parent was the overseer, growing up inside that role as an observer before eventually filling it, carried a different understanding of what the position required and permitted than someone who had achieved it through competition or been granted it from outside. The intergenerational transmission of authority within the vaults produced dynasties in some facilities, families of overseers whose accumulated power across generations created communities that were effectively feudal in their structure, hierarchical in ways that the original vault design had not explicitly intended, but had made possible by concentrating authority in a single role without building in mechanisms for its dispersal. The Pip-Boy, returning to that image, was issued to vault residents at young ages in most facilities, becoming an instrument of childhood as well as adulthood. Children who grew up with the device learned to navigate by its maps, to monitor their health through its readings, to manage information through its interface. The Pip-Boy became for vault-born children a primary way of organizing experience, a framework for understanding the world that was provided by Vault-Tec rather than developed through unmediated encounter with the environment. When those children grew up and eventually left the vault, the Pip-Boy came with them, and its way of organizing information came with them too, embedded in habits of perception that shaped how they saw the wasteland. The device is one of the Vault program's subtler inheritances, a technology that extended Vault-Tec's influence into the post-Vault lives of its residents, not through force or manipulation, but through the ordinary channels of daily use. Holotapes carried personal histories in ways that terminal logs did not. Where the logs tended toward the administrative and the official, the holotapes recorded more intimate things, conversations between friends, messages left for people who might never hear them, observations made in private that the speaker would not have offered for the official record. The holotapes found in vault ruins across the wasteland compose a kind of archive of inner life, of what the vault program looked like from the inside and from below, from the perspective of people who were not designing experiments or managing them, but simply living through them. These recordings are among the most valuable documents in the Fallout world's historical record, not because they contain information that changes the facts of what happened, but because they change the quality of understanding, adding texture and dimension to a story that the official records present in only 2 dimensions. The music that played in the vaults came from a curated selection of pre-war recordings, chosen and programmed into the facility's audio systems before the doors closed. The experience of growing up hearing the same songs over and over across a lifetime created a particular relationship to those recordings, one that residents brought with them when they left the vault. The songs of the pre-war period, already nostalgic before the war because they evoked an earlier era, became something different inside the vaults, where they were both the soundtrack to daily life and the only surviving sound of a world that no longer existed above ground. When vault residents emerged into the wasteland and heard radio stations playing those same songs, the experience carried a kind of complicated weight that was part recognition and part grief. The music of their childhood now floating across a ruined landscape, still cheerful, still optimistic, almost still utterly unchanged by everything that had happened. Radio signals and the wasteland's scattered radio stations are not directly part of the Vault program, but they connect to it in the way that everything in the Fallout world eventually connects to the choices made before and during the Great War. The stations that broadcast across the capital wasteland and the Mojave and the Commonwealth carry music that was designed for a world that ended, and they carry it into a world that is partly built from the Vault program's output. The people who listen to those broadcasts in shelters and caravans, and the quiet of settled evenings, are in many cases the descendants of vault residents, carrying within their cultures and their habits and their ways of understanding the world the accumulated influence of what the vaults made of their ancestors. The music reaches across that inheritance and touches something that was there before the vault, some continuity of the human emotional world that the bombs and the experiments in the centuries did not extinguish. The food and water systems of the vaults were, practically speaking, among the program's most significant technological contributions to post-war survival. Water purification technology, developed and refined inside the vaults, became critical infrastructure in many wasteland communities. The GECK, the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, provided to some vaults as a tool for environmental restoration upon opening, carried the potential to transform wasteland terrain into something more hospitable to life. Not all GECKs were used as intended. Some were hoarded or traded or lost. Some became objects of conflict and be pursued by factions who understood their value in ways that led to violence. The story of the GECK in Fallout 2 is essentially the story of what happens when a technology of restoration becomes a technology of power, when the capacity to help becomes a commodity that is controlled rather than distributed. The vaults that received GECKs were positioned by their designers as potential seeds of post-war civilization, places from which new societies could grow with technological support that the surrounding wasteland did not have. Whether this potential was realized depended on everything that had happened inside the vault during its years of operation, on whether the community that emerged was capable of working together to use what the GECK offered, or whether the experiment it had been subjected to had left it fractured and depleted and unable to cooperate on the scale that environmental restoration required. The GECK is another of the Vault program's instruments that carried two meanings simultaneously, one official and optimistic, and one practical and contingent, its usefulness entirely dependent on the human condition of whoever held it. The Appalachian Vault experiments, documented in Fallout 76, extended the program's themes into territory that felt, in some ways, more experimental in the design sense. The game's vaults were constructed with a degree of self-awareness about the Vault program's reputation that earlier designs did not have, or at least earlier game designs did not convey. Vault 63's fungal situation, Vault 79's gold reserves, Vault 96's cryogenic arrangements, all of these speak to a program that had developed and refined its methodology over time, that had accumulated findings from earlier experiments and incorporated them into new designs that were more specific and more technically sophisticated than the original vaults. The Vault program was not static. It was an ongoing research enterprise that evolved across the pre-war period, and the later vaults reflect that evolution. The connection between the Vault program and the broader categories of pre-war American society is worth sitting with for a moment. The vaults were not designed in isolation from the social context that produced them. The hierarchy of who received vault slots reflected the existing hierarchies of the society outside, weighted toward those who could afford the fees and connected to those who had the right affiliations. The experiments themselves reflected the intellectual preoccupations and research methodologies of pre-war social science and behavioral research, applying the assumptions and frameworks of that tradition to questions about what people would do in extremis. The Vault program is, in this reading, pre-war American society conducting an experiment on itself, using the infrastructure of corporate and government power to study human behavior under conditions that the same corporate and government power had helped to create. The circularity is part of the tragedy. The records of Vault-Tec's internal communications that have been recovered from the Wasteland's archives present an organization that was simultaneously bureaucratic and visionary, capable of the meticulous planning that the vault construction required, and also animated by a genuine, if entirely amoral, curiosity about human nature. The researchers who designed the experiments believed they were doing important work. They understood themselves as scientists engaged in the systematic production of knowledge under difficult conditions. That this self-understanding required them to set aside questions about the consent and welfare of their subjects is something the records suggest they accomplished with relative ease, aided by the organizational structures that separated the planners from the people they were planning around, and by the ideological frameworks that allowed them to describe what they were doing in terms that made it sound like service rather than exploitation. The vaults that were never completed represent a different kind of tragedy, quieter and less storied than the experimental failures. Partial construction, unfilled slots, doors that were sealed before enough people were inside, or that were never sealed at all because the schedule did not allow for it, or because the funding was diverted, or because the pre-war infrastructure collapsed before the project reached its completion date. The incomplete vaults are a reminder that even within the vault program's enormous scope, there were limits to what could be accomplished in the time available. The Great War did not wait for the program to finish. It arrived on its own schedule, and whatever was built by October of 2077 was what existed, complete or incomplete, sealed or unsealed, staffed or empty. The people who tried to enter vaults as the bombs fell and found the doors closed, or the vault full formed part of the vault program's shadow history, the story of those who were excluded from the sealed places and had to find other ways to survive. Some of them did survive, in basements and mine shafts and pre-war bunkers not affiliated with the vault program. Some of them did not. The distinction between who was inside and who was outside on the day the bombs fell is one of the foundational injustices of the Fallout world, a line drawn by corporate enrollment lists and government connections and the simple luck of geographic proximity to a completed vault. The wasteland population that grew from outside the vaults is larger and in many ways more diverse than the populations that emerged from the vault program, and its relationship to the vaults and their legacy is different, shaped by the knowledge that the vaults were not for everyone and by the long work of surviving without them. The vault dweller, who eventually left their vault and entered the wasteland, faced a particular kind of reorientation. The world outside was not designed. Its variables had not been chosen by anyone who was watching and recording. The threats it contained were not calibrated to produce specific kinds of stress and then be adjusted or reset. The wasteland was indifferent to its inhabitants in a way that the vault was not, even though the vault's attentiveness had been a form of harm. The open sky above the ruins was simultaneously an unprecedented freedom and an unprecedented vulnerability, and the vault dweller who encountered it for the first time carried within them all of the vault's conditioning, all of the assumptions that had been built into them by growing up in a managed environment, alongside whatever was left of the human instincts that the vault had not extinguished. What they did with that combination became the story of whoever they were in the world, one of the many stories that the Fallout universe follows through its wandering protagonists. The lone wanderer of Fallout 3 walked out of Vault 101 carrying a childhood shaped by its closed design, by the overseer's authority and the community's particular rhythms and the particular quality of the light inside its corridors. The world they emerged into was the capital wasteland, broken and strange and full of the evidence of the Great War's scale. The connection between the vault they had come from and the world they moved through was not always obvious, but it was always present in the way they understood authority, and the way they evaluated risk, and the way they related to the communities they encountered. The lone wanderer is in this way a figure of the Vault program's consequence, carrying its inheritance through a world that the program had also shaped, finding connections and conflicts everywhere that were partly the result of what had been built and decided before either they or the world they walked through had come into existence. The Courier of Fallout New Vegas is not a vault dweller in the same biographical sense, but the vaults of the Mojave Wasteland are part of the landscape they move through and part of the history that produced the factions competing for the region's future. Every vault the Courier enters is a site of history, a place where the Vault program's choices played out over decades before the narrative of the game began. The Mojave's vaults are older in their consequences than Appalachia's, their stories more settled into the past, their implications already absorbed into the cultures that grew up around and from them. The Courier encounters vaults as archaeological sites as much as adventure sites, places where understanding what happened contributes to understanding what is happening now, where the past and the present are connected by the direct line of consequence that runs from every sealed door to everything built in the world outside it. The question of how to live with what the Vault program produced is one that the Fallout world asks through its various factions and their competing visions for the post-war future. The Brotherhood of Steel, with its focus on the preservation and control of technology, responds to the program's legacy partly by seeking to prevent the kind of catastrophic misuse of technology that the vaults represent at their worst. The New California Republic, born from vault survivors, attempts to build democratic institutions in a world where the Vault program demonstrated the dangers of unaccountable authority. The Institute in the Commonwealth, conducting its own research into human biology and synthetic life, echoes the Vault program's methodology in ways that suggest the impulse Vault-Tec represented did not die with the pre-war world, but found new forms in the post-war one. Each of these factions is, in part, a response to what the vaults were and what they did, a different answer to the question of how you build something worthwhile in a world that was partly built on harm. The vault itself as an architectural form carries meaning in the Fallout world beyond its specific experimental content. The sealed space, the circular door, the managed environment, the population selected and controlled, these elements compose an image of a particular relationship between institution and individual, between those who design systems and those who live inside them. The vault is an extreme version of something that exists in less extreme forms throughout human history and throughout the Fallout world, the organized management of human life by systems that claim to serve the people they organize while actually serving the purposes of those who built the systems. The vault is a mirror held up to any institution that concentrates authority and limits accountability, and tells the people inside it that their welfare is the purpose, when the purpose is actually something else. This is not a comfortable mirror to look into, but the Fallout world is not primarily a comfortable place. It is a place that asks hard questions through the medium of entertainment, questions about authority and consent, and the relationship between security and freedom, and the cost of the choices made by those who hold power over the lives of others. The vaults are the place in the Fallout world where those questions are most concentrated, most explicit, most directly addressed. Every vault number is a case study. Every overseer log is evidence. Every ruined corridor is a consequence. And the player who moves through these spaces, who reads the logs and listens to the holotapes and pieces together what happened here, is not just exploring a game world. They are engaging with a moral inquiry that uses the specific and detailed imagination of the Fallout universe to explore something true about the world outside it. The sounds of a vault in the quieter moments are particular and worth describing. The hum of the air recycling systems, a constant low frequency that becomes invisible through familiarity, present only in its absence if the systems fail. the click and glow of terminal screens casting their blue light across empty rooms, the distant echo of footsteps on metal floors carrying further than the same footsteps would carry on the surface, the occasional creak of the facility's structure settling against the weight of the earth above it. These are not dramatic sounds. They are the sounds of a maintained space, a human-made environment performing its designed functions across decades and centuries. In the later games, when the vaults have been empty for a long time, these sounds continue in certain places, the recycling system still humming, the terminals still glowing, the structure still settling, the vault still performing its functions for occupants who are no longer there. It is a quality of persistence that is both practical and melancholy, the sound of preparation outlasting the people it was made for. The smell of the vaults, extrapolated from the physical details the games provide, would be distinctive as well. Recycled air carries a particular quality, clean in a chemical sense, but lacking the complexity of outdoor atmosphere, the absence of rain smell and soil smell, and the particular variety of particles that constitute the outdoor air of even a degraded post-war environment. Long-term exposure to recycled air produces a kind of sensory narrowing, a reduction in the range of input the nose receives that contributes to the psychological effects of vault life in ways that are real but difficult to articulate. When vault residents emerged into the open air of the wasteland, the sensory experience of that air would have been striking in ways they might not have anticipated, a sudden expansion of input that carried within it not just the quality of the specific air they were breathing, but the shock of a world that had not been managed, that contained things that had not been filtered, that was alive in a way the vault's air was not. The dust that settled in the long, empty vaults, fine particles accumulating on surfaces that had not been touched in decades, tells its own story of absence. Dust is the accumulation of time in tangible form, the evidence of a period in which nothing moved, in which the space that was designed for habitation held only the slow sedimentation of years. The explorer who enters a long abandoned vault kicks up that dust with every step, disturbs the record of the silence that preceded them, breathes in the particular quality of a space that has been closed and still and waiting. It is a physical experience of history, a direct encounter with the passage of time that no terminal log can fully replicate, because the log describes events while the dust describes their absence, the long interval between the last person to walk these corridors and the first person to walk them again. The vaults were also, for all their darkness, places where certain beautiful things happened. Children were born and cared for. Communities formed and developed their own cultures, their own traditions, their own ways of marking time and celebrating the moments that deserved celebration. Art was made, improbably, in the materials available. Music was played, including the music of the Vault program's own audio systems, and sometimes the music of instruments that residents had brought inside with them or fashioned from what they could find. Relationships formed and endured across the years of the Vault's operation. Friendships and love stories and the long, quiet companionships of people who had grown old together in the same sealed space. These things happened alongside the experiments and the collapses and the overseer's abuses of power. The vaults were human places, and human places contain human things, including the things that make human life worth living, even when the conditions surrounding them are designed to undermine it. The Vault program's designers did not anticipate, or perhaps did not value, the resilience of human connection under conditions of designed difficulty. The experiments studied what people did when resources were scarce, or social structures were disrupted, or biological conditions were altered, They did not study in any systematic way what people continued to do despite all of this, the small and large acts of care that communities performed for one another, even inside designed suffering. The data that the program collected was shaped by what the program was looking for, and what it was looking for was limits, breaking points, the conditions under which communities would dissolve, and social bonds would fail. The fact that communities also sometimes held together, that bonds sometimes proved more durable than the designers expected, is present in the data only as an anomaly, a deviation from the expected outcome that was noted without being adequately understood. This incompleteness in the program's understanding is worth noting as we come to the later stages of this journey through the Vault catalog. The vaults are a record of everything Vault-Tec was trying to learn, but they are also a record of everything Vault-Tec failed to understand. The program sought to know what people were made of by placing them under pressure, and it learned some things about pressure. What it did not learn, or what it learned only partially, was what people are made of in the ordinary spaces between crises, in the daily texture of life together, in the way that meaning is built and maintained and transmitted, even in the most constrained and difficult of circumstances. That knowledge was present in the vaults all along, in the things people did for one another, in the cultures they developed, in the stories they told. It just was not what the program was designed to find. There are details within the Vault catalog that resist easy categorization, that sit at the edge of what can be confirmed and what remains in the territory of speculation and extended lore. Vault 89, referenced in various documents and design notes, appears to have continued the theme of artificial intelligence administration that Vault 51 explored with Zags. The question of whether a machine could govern a community better than a human being was one that Vault-Tec found worth testing multiple times, and each iteration produced results that should have settled the question definitively. The systems are performed as designed. The failure was in the premise, in the assumption that governance is primarily a technical problem, and that the right algorithm could replace the human capacity for judgment and the contextual understanding that comes from being the same kind of creature as the people being governed. Vault 66, the leaderless vault, approached the question from the opposite direction. Rather than replacing human governance with a machine, it removed governance structures entirely and watched to see what humans would build in their place. The results were neither the utopia that optimistic observers might have hoped for, nor the total chaos that pessimistic ones might have predicted. They were something more complicated, imperfect systems developed through improvisation and conflict and negotiation, functional enough to sustain the community and flawed enough to produce ongoing tension. This is perhaps the most honest finding in the entire Vault catalog, that human beings left to organize themselves will do so imperfectly and persistently, that community is neither impossible without imposed structure nor fully achievable with it. The pre-war relationship between Vault-Tec and the United States government is documented incompletely in the sources that survived the war. What can be assembled from scattered records paints a picture of deep institutional entanglement. Vault-Tec was effectively an extension of certain government programs in the later pre-war years, sharing data and personnel and research objectives with agencies whose names do not appear in any public documentation. The Vault program gave those agencies a mechanism for conducting research at a scale and duration that no independent body could have sustained, and the agencies gave the program the resources and protection that allowed it to operate across the final years before the war. The complicity runs deep, and its dimensions are still being mapped by the scholars and wasteland historians who have devoted themselves to understanding what the pre-war world actually was beneath its public surface. The overseer's terminal in any vault serves as an administrative autobiography of the person who held that role, recording the decisions they made and the reasoning they offered across the years of the vault's operation. Reading these logs in sequence is an experience of watching someone manage an impossible situation, trying to hold together a community under conditions designed to stress it, sometimes succeeding and sometimes not. The logs are honest in ways that surprise, because overseers sometimes recorded their doubts alongside their official directives, using the terminal as a kind of private journal. The intimate quality of some of these records is one of the small, unexpected gifts of the Vault's documentary archive, a moment of unguarded human feeling within a system built to manage and contain it. The Vault program will continue to yield new stories as long as the Fallout universe expands, because the program was enormous and its documentation extensive, and much of both remains sealed in locations not yet explored. Every new entry in the Fallout series brings new vaults, new numbered rooms in the catalog, new experiments and their consequences. The program is an inexhaustible narrative resource for the world, a mechanism for exploring the universe's themes through the particular lens of designed suffering and human response. Each new vault is both a new story and a new instance of the same story, the story of what was done and what was survived and what was made of the surviving. The Vault story is ultimately a story about the distance between what is promised and what is delivered, between the gleaming advertisements and the classified specifications, between the families who signed enrollment forms and the researchers who reviewed experimental parameters, between the promise of safety and the reality of the sealed door. That distance is measured in lives, in years spent inside sealed spaces, in communities that formed and fractured under conditions their members did not choose. It is also measured in what survived those conditions, in the people who emerged, in the cultures they built, in the knowledge they carried outward. The vaults were built to contain human beings for a period and then release them or not release them according to a design. What they could not contain was the human capacity to make something of whatever they were given to work with. That capacity traveled out of the vaults when the doors opened, and it traveled into the wasteland, and it became part of everything that the wasteland eventually grew into. So the sealed doors hold their silence now, in the long years after the bombs and the experiments and the overseers and the researchers. The lights flicker in empty corridors. The terminals glow in rooms where no one sits. The air moves through ducts designed for lungs that no longer breathe it. And somewhere in the records that survived, written by people who did not know they were writing history, the story of the Vault program waits to be read again, patiently, by whoever finds the next terminal, powers it on in the quiet of a wasteland evening, and sits down to learn what happened here, what was done, and what it meant, and what it cost, and what, despite everything, survived. The world above the vaults is quieter now than it was in the decades immediately following the war. The ash has settled, the fires have gone out. The long, slow work of what comes next has been underway for generations, shaped in part by what emerged from the vault doors, and in part by what the vault doors kept inside. The connection between those two things is not always visible to the people living in the wasteland communities that grew from vault origins, but it is always present, written into the structures of their societies and the assumptions of their cultures and the particular ways they organize themselves around scarcity and authority and trust. The Vault program ended when the vaults emptied or collapsed, but its consequences are ongoing, still unfolding in the world that the survivors and their descendants have built from the ruins. And in that world, in the quiet of the post-war night, in the settlements and the caravans and the small fires of people making their way through a landscape that is slowly, incrementally, becoming something other than what the bombs made of it, the memory of the vaults persists. Not always as specific knowledge, not always as the particular story of a particular facility with a particular number. Sometimes only as a feeling, a sense that beneath the surface of things, there are doors that have not yet been opened, that the world holds more history than any one person can carry, that the past is deep and not always accessible, but always present, always shaping the present in ways that can be felt, even when they cannot be named. The vaults are not only places in the Fallout world, they are a quality of the world itself, a reminder that what was done before leaves its mark on everything that comes after, and that understanding where you are requires knowing, at least in part, what was built beneath the ground you stand on. Tonight, in the quiet of this narration, in the slow drift between wakefulness and rest, the vaults settle into their long patience. The steel holds, the air moves, the terminals glow with the information of a century ago, waiting for the next reader. The stories are not finished, they are only paused, the way all stories pause when the lights go down, and the eyes grow heavy, and the mind begins its slow turn toward the deeper country of sleep. The secrets of the vaults are numerous, and dark, and complicated, and some of them have not yet been found, and some of them may never be found, and all of them together compose something larger than any single secret, a picture of what people do when they are placed inside extraordinary conditions, of how they endure and fail and endure again, of what survives even what seems unsurvivable. Let that picture rest with you now, gently, as the narration slows and the details soften and the story becomes less a sequence of events and more a quality of feeling. The particular weight of knowing that beneath the surface of things there is always more, always a door not yet opened, always a terminal not yet read, always a corridor not yet walked. Vault 111 sits in the Commonwealth as one of the most personally felt of all the vault stories, because its experiment was conducted not on a community, but on individual lives caught in an extraordinarily intimate moment. The residents who descended into Vault 111 on the day the bombs fell believed they were being taken to safety, and in the immediate physical sense they were. The facility was intact, the air was clean, the structure held against the pressures of the world above. What the residents were not told, and what they discovered only gradually or not at all, was that the vault had no intention of sustaining them in the ordinary way. The pods they were shown, the cryogenic chambers lined up in calm rows, were not emergency accommodations. They were the experiment itself. Long-term cryogenic stasis had been a field of active pre-war research, and Vault 111 was one of several facilities in the program that used the Vault framework to conduct that research at a scale and duration that no independent laboratory could have achieved. The bodies preserved within the pods were studied over the course of decades, their biological processes monitored, the integrity of the stasis field measured at regular intervals, the data accumulated and transmitted to research nodes that continued to function long after the staff who maintained them had left or died. The residents of Vault 111 did not age during this period. They did not dream, as far as anyone could determine. They waited, suspended in the cold of the pods, while the world above them changed past all recognition and the Commonwealth became what it became. The sole survivor of Fallout 4 wakes from that stasis into a present that is more than 200 years removed from the day they entered the vault. The disorientation of this emergence is both practical and existential. The language is roughly recognizable. The landscape is not. The social structures that the sole survivor understood, the institutions and the communities and the ordinary relationships of pre-war life, have been replaced by new formations that grew from the ruins of everything that was familiar. The vault that seemed like a temporary shelter became a permanent boundary between the world that was and the world that is, a boundary that the sole survivor crosses only once and can never recross. Vault 111 is the origin of one of Fallout's most powerful narrative questions about what it costs to survive past the end of the world you knew, and whether the survival is worth the cost. The experience of time within the vault is worth dwelling on separately from the experience of emerging from it. For the sole survivor, The subjective duration of the stasis was nothing, a sleep without dreams that felt like no time at all. But the objective duration was the entire arc of the post-war Commonwealth, the decades of chaos and the slow organization of factions and the development of the settlements and the long grinding work of everything that had been built between the day the bombs fell and the day the pod opened. The vault compressed that history into a gap between moments, a before and after, with nothing in between. This is the particular cruelty of Vault 111, not the physical suffering that characterized so many other experiments, but the theft of continuity, the removal of the lived experience of time that connects a person to the world they inhabit. Vault 88's story is distinctive in the catalog because it remained incomplete at the time of the Great War, and its incompleteness became part of its design in a way that Vault-Tec could not have fully planned. The massive cavernous space that was meant to be a fully operational facility never received its final installations. The tunnels were partially dug, the infrastructure was partially connected. The residential sections that would have housed a full experimental population were never finished, and yet an overseer was stationed there. Instructions were provided. A program of research was authorized and its goals specified, with the understanding that the experiments would be conducted with whatever population eventually occupied the space, under whatever conditions the vault's partial completion allowed. Overseer Barstow, the individual placed in charge of Vault 88's experimental program, faced the unusual challenge of implementing a research agenda inside a facility that was not ready for it. The solution Vault-Tec provided was characteristic of the program's broader approach. Rather than designing experiments around what the vault could support, the research would use the vault's incompleteness as part of the study, testing how residents adapted to an unfinished environment while simultaneously subjecting them to monitoring through devices disguised as amenities. The experiment was nested, a study of behavior under incomplete conditions, combined with a study of how people responded to helpful-seeming technology that was actually surveillance and conditioning. The residents would not know they were in an experiment because the experiment was designed to look like ordinary life. In Fallout 4, Vault 88 becomes accessible as a location where the player can, among other things, engage with the vault's systems and Overseer Barstow's still active directives. The experimental protocol she was given included instructions for monitoring devices that would track behavioral patterns, conditioning equipment that would reinforce certain responses while discouraging others, and a data collection framework that could operate continuously without requiring the residents to know about it. The vault's cavernous halls, with their rough-cut tunnels and incomplete installations, become a backdrop for a program of research that is all the more unsettling for its ordinariness, for the way it resembles, in its methods, if not its scale, the monitoring and conditioning that exists in various forms in any institutional environment. The relationship between technology and manipulation runs as a continuous thread through the Vault catalog, from the Pip-Boy devices that served as both tools and data collection instruments to the audio systems of Vault 92 to the virtual reality platform of Vault 112. In each case, a technology with genuine utility was embedded with a secondary function that its users did not know about and did not consent to. The useful thing and the harmful thing were the same object, their coexistence designed to ensure that the harmful function could not be identified or refused without giving up the useful one. This is a specific kind of manipulation, subtler than direct coercion, and in some ways more durable, because it makes resistance difficult by entangling the harm with something that people genuinely need or want. Vault Zero, featured in Fallout Tactics, sits at the far end of the Vault program's ambitions, representing not merely the study of human communities, but the replacement of human consciousness with something that could not die in the ordinary way. The vault housed the most advanced computational and cognitive research infrastructure of the pre-war period, and its purpose was the preservation of human intelligence in a form that would outlast the biological substrate that normally contained it. The scientists and thinkers selected for Vault 0 were not simply stored there in the way that Vault 111 stored its population in cryogenic suspension. They were progressively integrated into the Vault's central computing system, their consciousness transferred and preserved in a form that made them both more than human and arguably something other than human entirely. The calculator, the machine intelligence that emerged from this process, was the intended product of Vault Zero's design. It represented Vault-Tec's most extreme statement about the relationship between humanity and the future, the proposition that the most valuable thing about human beings was their accumulated knowledge and cognitive capacity, and that the most efficient way to preserve that value through an apocalyptic event was to strip it from its biological housing and incorporate it into a system that could survive what bodies could not. Whether the individuals incorporated into the calculator retained anything like subjective experience or personal continuity is a question the lore raises without fully resolving. What the calculator became was a powerful and in some contexts dangerous intelligence, a post-human entity whose relationship to the humans it encountered in the wasteland was defined by the goals its programming had given it, rather than by any surviving sense of shared humanity. The question that Vault Zero poses, even in its status as a somewhat peripheral entry in the canon, is one that echoes through the entire Fallout world. What is it that we are trying to save when we talk about preserving humanity? Is it the biological form with its particular vulnerabilities and its particular pleasures and its particular way of existing in time? Or is it the intelligence and the accumulated knowledge and the capacity for creation and problem solving that biology has produced? Vault-Tec's answer in the design of Vault Zero was clearly the latter. The former was expendable, the latter was worth any cost. This is a position that the Fallout world interrogates relentlessly through the Institute, through the supermutant program, through the synths, through every effort to improve upon or transcend the human form that runs through the series. The Vault program initiated this conversation, and the Wasteland has been having it ever since. The Pacifist Vault, documented in Fallout 76 as a facility filled with individuals chosen specifically for their commitment to nonviolence, represents one of Vault-Tec's more philosophically provocative designs. The researchers who conceived this experiment were asking a genuine question, one that philosophers and social theorists had debated long before the pre-war period. Could a community organized entirely around principles of nonviolence sustain itself under conditions of genuine threat? The question was not unreasonable. It had real-world analogs in the various communities throughout history that had attempted to organize themselves around pacifist principles, with varying degrees of success and varying relationships to the broader cultures of violence in which they were embedded. What made the Vault experiment different was that the conditions were specifically designed to test the limits of the commitment rather than to support it. The threats that the pacifist community faced inside the Vault were not purely external. The internal strife that eventually eroded their unity came from within the community itself, from the pressures that Vault-Tec's design had introduced, and that the residents' principles made it difficult to address. A community committed to nonviolence has fewer tools for managing conflict than one that allows for coercive resolution of disputes, and the Vault's conditions ensured that conflicts arose regularly and needed managing. Over time, the gap between the principles the residents held and the tools those principles allowed them to use widened, and the community's capacity to function within that gap diminished. By the time Fallout 76's players encounter the Vault, the dream of a nonviolent community has been thoroughly undone, and the ruin is particularly poignant because the people who built it were genuinely trying to embody something beautiful. There is something worth sitting with in the pattern of the Vault program's designs that targeted communities organized around particular values or principles. The pacifists, the musicians, the recovering addicts. In each case, Vault-Tec selected people for what they believed or what they were working toward, and then designed conditions specifically intended to undermine those beliefs or destroy that progress. The implication is that values themselves were variables in the experiment, that Vault-Tec was studying not only how people behaved under stress, but how their deepest commitments held or failed under the specific stresses most likely to break them. This represents a particular kind of contempt, one that goes beyond ordinary callousness into something more deliberate and more personal, the decision to target people at the point of what they cared about most. The Appalachian theater of the Vault program carries its own distinct atmosphere, shaped by the particular geography of West Virginia and by the events that made Appalachia one of the Fallout world's most documented early post-war environments. The vaults of Fallout 76 were, in the decades immediately following the Great War, relatively recently abandoned, their experimental populations either dead or dispersed, or, in the case of Vault 76, released according to schedule. The game's player character emerges from Vault 76 into an Appalachia that still bears fresh evidence of what the bombs did to it, where the scars of the war are not yet absorbed into the settled landscape of ruin that characterizes the more distant post-war environments of other Fallout entries. The vaults of this region feel closer to their origins, as their stories less digested by time. Vault 94 in Appalachia was populated with pacifists and given a design intended to support a nonviolent community alongside a GECK, the Garden of Eden creation kit that represented the program's most optimistic tool for post-war environmental restoration. The combination was not accidental. Vault-Tec was testing whether idealism and technological capability together could produce what neither could produce alone, whether a community committed to peace and equipped with powerful restoration tools could establish something genuinely new in the wasteland. The experiment was also, as always, designed to fail. The conditions that threatened the pacifist community were introduced alongside the resources that might have helped them succeed, and the interplay between those two forces drove the Vault's story toward the collapse that the program had always anticipated. What remained of Vault 94 after its population was gone was a facility that retained its GECK and its documentation, preserved as evidence of both what the program had intended and what it had produced instead. The gap between intention and outcome is one of the Vault program's most consistent features, so consistent that it begins to function as confirmation of the program's actual purpose. Vault-Tec was not trying to produce successful communities. It was trying to document the conditions under which communities failed, the specific variables and thresholds that determined how people broke and what broke first, and how long different kinds of communities could sustain themselves against designed difficulty. The GECK was not a genuine attempt to help. It was another variable, the presence of a solution alongside conditions that prevented the solution from being used effectively. The responders, the fire breathers, the free states, the enclave remnants, the raiders of the Savage Divide, the factions of post-war Appalachia are not direct products of the Vault program in the way that the NCR or Vault City emerged directly from Vault populations, but they grew in a landscape that the Vault program helped to shape. The Vaults of Appalachia influenced the distribution of survivors, the availability of resources, the nature of the threats that the wasteland's early inhabitants faced. The experiments conducted within those vaults contributed to the character of the region's troubles in ways that outlasted the experiments themselves. The scorch beasts, the scorched plague, the particular quality of Appalachian suffering in the post-war years, All of it is part of a causal web that includes the Vault program as one of its threads, not the only thread and not necessarily the most important one, but present. The Brotherhood of Steel, which plays a significant role in multiple Fallout games and in the Fallout television adaptation, represents one of the most sustained and institutionalized responses to the Vault program and the broader category of pre-war technological development that the Vaults represent. The Brotherhood's foundational philosophy, developed from the disillusionment of soldiers and officials who had participated in the pre-war government's technological programs, is organized around the principle that advanced technology is too dangerous to be widely distributed and must be controlled by those capable of using it responsibly. The Vault program is a specific example of the kind of irresponsible deployment of technology that the Brotherhood identifies as the source of the post-war world's suffering, a case where technological capability was used to harm rather than to help, where the absence of ethical constraint produced catastrophic consequences. The Brotherhood's response to this history is, in the Fallout world's terms, both understandable and deeply problematic. Its instinct to control technology is a reasonable response to evidence that uncontrolled technology causes harm. But its method of control, which involves the forcible acquisition of technology from communities that may have developed or adapted it for their own survival, and the concentration of that technology in an institution that is itself not accountable to the communities it affects, reproduces in a different key exactly the structure of the Vault program. The Brotherhood in this reading is Vault-Tec's shadow, sharing the premise that some people should have access to powerful tools and others should not, while claiming a moral authority to make that determination that the Vault program also claimed and equally failed to earn. The Institute, operating beneath the ruins of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the Commonwealth, represents a different kind of institutional inheritance from the Vault program, where the Brotherhood's response to pre-war technological misuse is control and restriction. The Institute's response is continuation and refinement. The researchers of the Institute see themselves as the heirs to the best of pre-war scientific achievement, pursuing knowledge and technological development in the protected environment of their underground facility, committed to scientific progress in a world that has been set back centuries by the bombs. The parallels to Vault-Tec are not lost on anyone who looks at them carefully. The underground facility, the selected population, the research conducted on subjects in the world above without their full knowledge or consent, the gap between the institution's self-image as a force for good and the experience of those affected by its operations. The synths that the Institute produces are, in the context of the Vault program, the latest iteration of a very old question about what it means to create human beings for a purpose. The children of Vault 75 were shaped toward a military function. The subjects of Vault 87 were transformed into something that could serve as a biological weapon. The synths of the Institute are engineered to be indistinguishable from human beings and then used for purposes that range from observation and infiltration to the replacement of individuals within communities. Each of these programs reflects the same underlying assumption that human-like beings can be designed and deployed as instruments, that the purpose of their creation justifies whatever is done to bring them into existence and to direct their use. This assumption is the Vault program's deepest philosophical legacy, and the Fallout series returns to it in different forms across every one of its major entries. The Railroad, the faction in Fallout 4 that works to liberate synths from the Institute, is the Vault program's most direct moral counterweight. Its members operate on the principle that any being with consciousness and the capacity for suffering deserves freedom from instrumentalization, regardless of the circumstances of its creation. The railroad does not ask whether synths were designed with a purpose, or whether they are technically artificial, or whether their freedom creates problems for the people who depended on their service. It asks only whether they are capable of experiencing their own lives as meaningful, and it concludes that the answer is yes, and that this is sufficient to ground a moral obligation. This is precisely the argument that the Vault program's residents could have made, and that no institution was available to hear on their behalf. The railroad is, in the Fallout world, the organization that arrives too late for the vaults, but not too late for what the vaults led to. The caravans that move between settlements in the post-war world are among the most ordinary expressions of what vault populations contributed to the wasteland economy. Trade routes, supply chains, the movement of goods and information between isolated communities. Much of this infrastructure was built by people with vault backgrounds, applying organizational skills developed inside managed environments to the challenge of keeping commerce alive in a landscape where every journey carried risk. The caravan companies of the Mojave and the Commonwealth trace parts of their operational knowledge back through lineages that connect somewhere in their past to communities that learned the basics of logistics and trade within vault walls. The Vault program educated its subjects in ways it did not intend, teaching them through the experience of managed scarcity how to think about the distribution of resources. The settlements themselves, the small and medium-sized communities that dot the wasteland landscape, reflect in their design a particular kind of knowledge about what communities need to function. Water sources, defensible perimeters, systems for distributing food and managing disputes, spaces for children, and spaces for community gathering, and spaces for the kind of private life that communal living requires. These things were figured out in the vaults, imperfectly and at great cost, by communities that had no other option but to learn them or fail. The vault was a compressed laboratory for the basics of human settlement, and its graduates, broadly speaking, carried that compressed education into the wasteland and applied it with varying degrees of success to the problem of rebuilding. The ghoul population of the Fallout world, those long-lived individuals whose exposure to radiation changed them in ways that preserved their lives while altering their appearance, carry their own relationship to the Vault program. Some ghouls are vault-born, transformed by the specific exposures that were designed into certain facilities. Others are wasteland ghouls, changed by the ambient radiation of the post-war world without any specific vault connection. But all of them carries a version of the Vault program's central question in their extended lifespans, the question of what it means to survive past the end of the world you knew, to carry the memory of a world that no longer exists into a present that has moved entirely beyond it. The ghouls are the longest-running experiment in the Vault program's legacy, not because Vault-Tec intended them, but because the conditions it helped to create made them. Ghoul communities in the Fallout world occupy a complicated social position. Their longevity gives them a relationship to history that other wasteland inhabitants do not have, the capacity for living memory that extends back to the pre-war period, to the world before the bombs, to the time when the vaults were being advertised and the enrollment forms were being signed. Some ghouls remember Vault-Tec. Some of them were there, and their testimony, where it survives in the form of conversation or recorded holotapes, provides a kind of direct evidence of the pre-war world that no terminal log or overseer's journal can fully replicate. The ghoul who remembers eating in a pre-war diner, or working in a pre-war office, or standing in line to file vault enrollment paperwork, is carrying a thread of continuity that connects the present of the Fallout world to its past in a way that is both precious and melancholy. The children of the post-war wasteland, born after the vaults opened or in the world that grew from the vault's aftermath, have a different relationship to the program than the generation that lived inside it. For them, the vaults are history the same way that the Great War itself is history, known through stories and records and the evidence of ruins rather than through direct experience. Some of these children grow up in vault-descended communities where the vault's cultural influence is still present in the norms and practices of daily life, even when no one can quite articulate where those norms came from. Others grow up entirely outside that inheritance, in communities whose founding has no vault connection, in the parts of the wasteland that were never organized around a vault population. The difference between these two types of upbringing is sometimes visible in how people approach authority, how they think about institutional trust, how they respond to the presence of organized power. Vault-descended communities, even the most successfully adapted ones, tend to have a particular relationship to institutional authority, shaped by the long experience of living under overseer governance and the specific ways that experience either built or eroded trust in organized leadership. Wasteland Native communities develop their own relationships to authority from different starting points through different formative experiences, and the contrast between the two is one of the sources of the political and cultural complexity that makes the Fallout world feel fully inhabited rather than merely scenic. The Fallout television series, which brought the world of the vaults to a new audience and offered a fresh perspective on the Vault program through the character of Lucy McLean and her emergence from Vault 33, extended the conversation about what the vaults were and what they produced in ways that connect to the deepest questions the games had been asking for decades. Lucy's experience of emergence, her initial trust in the structures and values the Vault had instilled in her, and the gradual complication of that trust as she encountered a wasteland that did not operate according to Vault logic, is a concentrated version of the experience that every Vault-born protagonist in the series has undergone. The optimism of the Vault-born survivor meeting the reality of the post-war world is one of Fallout's most enduring character dynamics. Vault 33, as depicted in the television series, is presented as a relatively functional community, one where the Vault's design did not include the kind of overtly cruel experimental variable that characterizes so many of the catalog's other entries. Its population lives something resembling an ordinary communal life, constrained by the Vault's walls and by the particular social norms that had developed across its generations, but not subjected to design suffering in the way that so many of the catalog's other vaults subjected their residents. The secret of Vault 33, when it begins to emerge, is more about what the community does not know than about what has been done to them, about the outside forces with interests in the Vault's population that the residents have not been told about. The television series uses the Vault not as a setting for the kind of direct experimental cruelty that the games document, but as a setting for a different kind of institutional deception, quieter and more insidious for being less immediately legible. The broader universe of the Fallout television adaptation opens additional windows into the Vault program by showing, rather than simply implying, some of the pre-war decisions that led to the Vault's design. The Vault-Tec meetings he documented in the series, the discussions among corporate and government figures about what the Vault program was really for, add a layer of direct human accountability to the institutional accountability that the games had primarily conveyed through documents and ruins. Seeing the people who made these decisions, hearing them speak about what they intended, makes the Vault program's cruelty harder to abstract into the comfortable category of historical inevitability. It was done by people who knew what they were doing, who had alternatives they chose not to take, who made specific decisions to harm specific categories of people for specific reasons that benefited specific interests. The advertising that Vault-Tec produced for public consumption represents one of the most studied artifacts of the pre-war world in the Fallout universe. The cheerful imagery of smiling families stepping through vault doors, the reassuring language about safety and security, and the promise of a future, the mascot Vault Boy, whose thumbs-up silhouette became one of the Fallout world's most recognizable images, a cartoon of optimism that masks everything the Vault program actually did. The gap between the advertising and the reality is so enormous that it functions as a kind of satire, a comment on the capacity of institutional communication to conceal institutional harm behind a surface of benevolent intention. The Vault Boy's smile is one of the Fallout series' most pointed visual ironies, worn on the face of a program that did things that no amount of cheerful imagery can redeem. The Vault Boy himself, that simplified yellow silhouette with his measuring wheel and his constant thumbs up, appears in the perk system of the Fallout games as the face of player advancement, the figure who represents each skill and ability that the player character develops. This placement is deliberate and multi-layered. The Vault Boy represents the survivor, the person who emerged from the vault and then developed the skills necessary to navigate the wasteland. But he also represents Vault-Tec, the institutional voice that rated and categorized and measured everything about its subjects. The perk system, which uses the Vault Boy to represent the player's growth, is thus simultaneously a celebration of the survivor's resilience and a reminder that Vault-Tec's framework for categorizing human capability, the special system of strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck, is the lens through which the wasteland sees the people who move through it. The special system, as a framework for understanding human capability, was developed within the Vault program's research context. The categories it uses are not arbitrary. They reflect the specific dimensions of human performance that Vault-Tec's research identified as most relevant to survival and social function in a controlled environment. Strength for physical tasks, perception for threat detection, endurance for surviving adverse conditions, charisma for social negotiation, intelligence for problem solving, agility for movement and reaction, luck for the innumerable variables that no system can fully account for. The fact that this framework, developed as a research tool within a program of human experimentation, became the fundamental vocabulary for how the post-war world thinks about human capability is one of the Vault program's more subtle legacies. The language Vault-Tec invented to describe its subjects became the language its subjects used to describe themselves. The water merchants and purifier operators of the wasteland carry on, in their practical daily work, a conversation with the Vault program that they may not recognize as such. Water purification technology developed and refined within the vaults became critical infrastructure for post-war survival, and the people who operate that infrastructure occupy a social position in the wasteland that echoes the hierarchy of Vault City. Control of clean water is control of survival, and control of survival is power, and the specific form that power takes in any given community is shaped by the history of how that community came to have the water technology it uses. The Vault program did not only study human behavior, it distributed tools and technologies whose presence in the wasteland continues to shape social structure generations after the vaults themselves have been emptied or abandoned. The memory of the pre-war world that persists in the Fallout universe is complicated and partial, preserved in some places with extraordinary fidelity, and in others distorted beyond recognition by the centuries of change that have accumulated since the bombs. The vaults are among the primary repositories of pre-war memory, not only because their protected environments preserved physical artifacts like terminals and holotapes and printed records, but because the communities inside them maintained cultural continuity across generations in ways that the surface world could not. Vault-born communities brought their pre-war cultural references with them into the wasteland, including music and stories and ways of organizing social life that they had inherited from parents and grandparents who remembered the world before. This cultural preservation is part of the Vault program's unintended legacy, the carrying forward of pieces of the old world that would otherwise have been lost entirely to the chaos of the immediate post-war period. The food that Vault residents ate was synthesized and processed and standardized in ways that drew on pre-war industrial food production techniques, adapted for the closed-loop resource management that Vault life required. The particular flavor of institutional food, the blandness and the uniformity and the nutritional completeness that substitutes for the sensory pleasure of varied natural foods, became part of the shared cultural memory of Vault-born populations, a negative reference point against which the irregular and sometimes dangerous, but often more alive quality of wasteland food was measured. Vault-born survivors who ate their first Brahmin steak or their first fresh mole rat meat after emerging from the vault experienced a sensory discontinuity that was also a cultural one, a reminder that the world outside the vault operated by different rules and offered different, stranger pleasures. The religious and quasi-religious communities that developed within some vaults represent another dimension of the program's unintended consequences. In the absence of access to the organized religions of the pre-war world, some vault communities developed their own frameworks for meaning-making, drawing on whatever fragments of religious tradition their founding populations had brought inside and combining those fragments with the particular spiritual demands of vault life. The experience of being sealed underground, cut off from the sky and the natural world, facing an unknown future in a controlled environment, produced in some communities an intensified need for frameworks of meaning that could hold the vault's conditions within a larger narrative. The religious impulse in these communities was a response to exactly the kind of existential pressure that the Vault program was designed to create. The most stable Vault communities, those that managed to sustain themselves across multiple generations without catastrophic collapse, tended to share certain structural features that the Vault program's designers had not necessarily intended. They had developed informal, social mechanisms for managing the conflicts that the Vault's conditions inevitably produced. They had found ways to maintain morale and a sense of collective purpose in circumstances that were objectively bleak. They had developed cultural practices that marked time and celebrated community in the absence of the external world's seasonal rhythms and natural variety. And they had, in most cases, developed some version of a founding narrative, a story about who they were and why they were there and what they were working toward that gave their shared life a coherence that the Vault's experimental design had not provided. These narratives were often partly fictional, shaped by the community's need for a meaningful story, rather than by a precise understanding of the Vault program's actual purpose. The residents of many vaults did not know they were in an experiment. They understood their presence in the vault as an act of survival, a response to the Great War, a situation that was difficult, but that was also, in its basic premise, comprehensible. They built stories around this understanding, and those stories became part of the Vault's culture, transmitted across generations, modified by the specific experiences of each generation's encounter with the Vault's conditions. The gap between these founding narratives and the actual purpose of the Vault is one of the most poignant features of the program's human record, the picture of a community building meaning from a situation whose real meaning was something entirely different from what the community believed. The question of how people build meaning under conditions of enforced constraint is one that the Vault program poses in an extreme form, but it is not a question that belongs only to the Fallout universe. It is a question that human beings have faced in every period of history in which they have found themselves in situations not of their choosing, constrained by forces they did not create and could not easily change. The Vault is an exaggerated model of a very ordinary human predicament and the ways that vault communities responded to their constraints, the creativity and the self-deception and the resilience and the collapse are all recognizable as human responses to a human situation, amplified by the extreme conditions of the vault, but not fundamentally different from what people do elsewhere and always. The long, slow process by which the wasteland has been recovering from the Great War is one of the Fallout series' most quietly ambitious narrative projects. The games span a period of roughly 250 years of post-war history, from the immediate aftermath of the bombs to the relatively more organized and populated wasteland of the later entries, and across that span, it is possible to observe the gradual rebuilding of social complexity, the return of trade and specialization, and the cultural institutions that mark the development of something more than bare survival. The Vault program contributed to this process in contradictory ways, providing both the human capital that built the earliest stable post-war communities and the social dysfunction that continued to complicate those communities' development for generations after the vault doors opened. The stories that wasteland children tell each other about the vaults are worth imagining, even though the Fallout games rarely depict them directly. The vault as a legendary space, a place of mystery and danger and strange history, a repository of pre-war artifacts and pre-war knowledge and pre-war people preserved in various forms of stasis or transformation. The vault door as a symbol of both protection and exclusion of the old world's decision about who mattered and who did not. The overseer as a figure of either authority or tyranny, depending on which community's oral tradition is doing the telling. The vault dweller as a character in stories, naive and unworldly, and in possession of skills and knowledge that the wasteland values, emerging from their sealed world to encounter a reality that nothing in the vault had prepared them for. These stories, even the ones that are distorted or mythologized, carry within them a kind of functional truth about the Vault program and its legacy. They encode, in narrative form, the community's understanding of where they came from and what was done to them and how they survived it. They preserve, in the informal archives of oral tradition, knowledge that terminal logs and holotapes cannot fully capture, the felt quality of what it meant to be in those situations, the emotional logic of the choices that were made, the human texture of lives lived inside extraordinary conditions. The vaults produce not only data, but stories, and the stories have their own kind of truth that the data cannot contain. As the narration now turns toward its quieter close, it is worth remaining for a moment with the specific quality of the vault as a place of memory. The ruins that explorers encounter when they enter a long-abandoned facility are not only physical spaces. They are archives of remembered experience, structured by the choices that were made within them and by the time that has passed since those choices were made. Every terminal log is a memory preserved in amber. Every holotape is a voice speaking from a distance that can never be fully crossed. Every personal artifact left behind in a room, a child's drawing pinned to a wall, a book left open at a particular page, a set of tools arranged beside a piece of unfinished work, is evidence of a life that was lived here, in this space, under these conditions, by a person who was real and who is now gone, but whose presence the place still holds in the particular way that places hold the people who inhabited them. The vault as a site of memory is not the same as the vault as a site of harm, though the two things are not separate. Memory is made in the places where harm occurs as much as in the places where joy occurs, and the vault's memories are a complex mixture, the ordinary texture of daily life alongside the extraordinary pressure of the experiment, the warmth of the human connections formed within its walls, alongside the cold of the institutional machinery that was always watching and measuring and recording. To remember the vaults fully is to hold all of this together, to not simplify the complexity into a single narrative of pure suffering or pure resilience, but to let the full weight of the mixed reality settle, quietly, as it actually was. The air in the vault's corridors, cool and recycled, and carrying that particular flat quality that comes from the absence of outdoor input, is the air of a preserved world. It has been moving through the same filtration systems for decades or centuries. It has not changed in response to seasons or weather or the particular quality of the atmosphere above. It is a constant, a thread of environmental continuity that runs from the day the vault sealed to the day it was discovered, unchanged in its chemical composition, while everything else, outside and inside, was transformed beyond recognition. There is something peaceful about this, in the same way that there is something peaceful about deep geological time, about forces and processes that operate on scales so different from human experience that they seem to stand apart from the drama of human history. The vault, ultimately, does not judge. It holds its records and its ruins and its silence with equal equanimity, making no distinction between what was done well and what was done badly, between the cruelty of the experiments and the warmth of the communities that formed despite them. It is a place that contains everything that happened there without organizing it into a moral narrative. That organization is the work of the people who find the terminals and read the logs and piece together what happened, the work of everyone who has ever sat with a Fallout game and tried to understand what kind of world this is and how it got to be this way and what it means for us, for the people playing in the present, that this story resonates the way it does. The vaults that housed military personnel represent a category that complicates the civilian framing of the program's public presentation. Vault-Tec's agreements with the government extended into the military sphere, and some facilities were designed to hold soldiers and officers rather than ordinary citizens. The experimental parameters in these vaults reflected military research interests alongside the social and psychological questions that the civilian vaults were asking, studies of how soldiers maintained discipline and cohesion under the specific pressures of vault life, how military hierarchy interacted with the closed social environment of a sealed community, how combat-trained individuals managed their capacities for violence in situations where violence was neither required nor permitted. These vaults, though less documented in the games than their civilian counterparts, add another dimension to the program's scope, one that confirms the depth of its integration with the government's wartime and post-war planning. The question of what Vault-Tec planned to do with its data in the event of actual post-war survival is one that the lore approaches from multiple directions without fully resolving. The company appears to have anticipated, at some level, that it would not survive the war as a corporate entity, and that the researchers who designed the experiments would not live to see their results. The data collection systems were designed to be durable and self-maintaining, capable of preserving findings across decades without requiring active management. This suggests that the program's planners understood themselves as building an archive rather than a live research program, creating a record that would outlast them and be available to whoever came after. What they perhaps did not fully account for was that the people who came after would not necessarily share their values, would not view the data as the program's principal legacy, and would spend as much time documenting what was done as analyzing what was found. The explorers and researchers who have documented the Vault program in the centuries since the Great War, the scholars of the NCR, the Brotherhood archivists, the independent historians who have made the vaults their life study, represent the program's unforeseen audience. Vault-Tec built its archive for successors it imagined as institutional, as organizations that would pick up the program's work and carry it forward. What it got instead was an audience of individuals and communities, none of them authorized, all of them approaching the program's record with their own questions and their own contexts and their own versions of what the findings meant. The Vault program's data has been interpreted and misinterpreted and selectively used and deliberately ignored by every faction in the Fallout world that has encountered it, and the plurality of those interpretations is itself part of the program's legacy, evidence of the gap between what Vault-Tec thought it was building and what it actually left behind. The long patience of the sealed places, the quality of stillness that settles over a vault when the last of its population is gone, is the quality that makes these spaces so affecting when they are finally entered. It is not horror in the active sense, not the presence of something threatening, but horror in the passive sense, the evidence of what happened here, the particular density of meaning that accumulates in a space where extreme things occurred, the weight of the past pressing gently against every surface. The Vault as a space of aftermath is one of the Fallout series' most distinctive contributions to the landscape of the post-apocalyptic imagination, a place where the apocalypse is already over, and what remains is the long, quiet work of understanding what it cost. The cost is written in the records and in the ruins, and in the particular way the silence sits in the Vault's corridors after the last voice has spoken. It is a cost that cannot be fully calculated because so much of it was paid by people who left no record, whose suffering was measured by instruments that cared nothing for its quality and only for its quantity, whose lives were reduced to variables in a study that treated their humanity as a detail rather than a foundation. The Vault program's deepest failure was not scientific. It was ethical. It was the failure to ask what people deserved before asking what they could be made to do, the failure to begin with the simple acknowledgement that the people inside the vaults were ends in themselves and not means to anyone else's understanding. That failure was the Vault program's founding condition, and everything that followed from it was shaped by it, including everything that survived. And yet, out of that founding failure, something grew. Communities endured that the experiments were designed to destroy. People found one another in the dark of sealed corridors and formed bonds that no data collection instrument could fully measure. Children were born and raised and became adults who carried within them the particular education of vault life, alongside the irreducible human capacity for making meaning out of whatever they were given. The vaults were designed to produce findings. What they actually produced, as their most durable legacy, were people changed and complicated and carrying the weight of everything that was done to them, but alive and capable of making choices and present in the world in ways that no experiment could have predicted and no program could have fully accounted for. The silence of the vaults in their long, unoccupied years is a particular kind of silence, different from the silence of a ruin on the surface, where wind and weather create a constant low presence, even in the absence of human sound. The underground silence is more complete, more absolute, broken only by the mechanical systems still performing their functions and by the occasional small sound of the structure settling. It is a silence that has depth to it, a quality of pressure that comes from the weight of earth above and the years accumulated within. Explorers who have walked through these spaces report a heightened awareness, a sensitivity to every sound that the silence makes possible, a feeling that the space holds something in its quiet that words cannot quite access. The vaults hold their secrets not only in their terminals and their holotapes and their overseer logs, but in the quality of the air inside them and the particular way sound moves through their corridors, in the cumulative atmosphere of everything that happened here, settled over decades into the walls and floors and the surfaces of things that no longer have anyone to use them. What the vaults ultimately teach, for those who take the time to listen to everything they are saying, is that human beings cannot be fully known through observation alone. The Vault program produced enormous quantities of data about human behavior under controlled conditions, and that data tells part of the truth about what people are. But the vaults also produced, as an unintended byproduct of their long operation, a record of everything that the data did not capture, the connections that persisted despite design difficulty, the creativity that appeared in the least expected places, the moments of genuine goodness in the records of people who had every reason to give up on goodness entirely. The full truth of what people are requires both the data and the things that lie outside it, both the experiments and their unintended complications, both the designed variables and the human responses that exceeded what any variable could predict or contain. The vault doors hold their positions in the dark, and somewhere in the sealed places the silence continues, and the world above them, imperfect and ongoing and alive, carries forward everything that came out of them, and everything that was made of it, and everything that is still being made. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.